It's a kind of homecoming for me. It really feels good. Indeed, out of the media sphere back to colleagues. It also makes me slightly nervous. I've already said to several of you, you've seen all of this already. You may get bored. But still, I will try to really indeed share with you what my book is about. And my book comes out of a sort of frustration that has been built up for many, many years, decades, I should say. And the paradox is that migration is one of the most hotly debated, but at the same time also most poorly understood phenomenon, apparently. And at some point I started to realize there's a relation between that hotly debated status of migration and the lack of knowledge because of the polarization. Because of the polarization, the nuance gets out of the window. And it really happened to me several times in previous times when I was involved in the debate about Syrian refugees, for instance, that journalists framed this whole thing as pro and anti-migration or tried to cast me as a researcher as pro-migration. And that's one point that I describe in my book. I really got angry. I said, this is exactly the problem. Have you ever asked an economist whether he's in favor or against the economy? And this is how silly it is. To be generally against or in favor of migration is like to be in favor or against markets, work, or agriculture. It's just a silly way of thinking about migration. And also this way of thinking seems to be, particularly when you think about the anti-migration point of view, it seems to be thinking away a fundamental element of who we are as human beings and as societies. So the nuance gets out of the window. What you also see is that pro and anti-camps in the political sphere tend to hugely exaggerate the harms and benefits of migration. And it leads to sort of entirely wrong way and biased way of thinking about migration. And this really, I think, this polarization has been paralyzing migration debates for decades now and is a major obstacle for gaining a better understanding of migration because it doesn't leave any room for nuance. For a while I thought, like many researchers think, well, I'm going to write reports and put up policy recommendations and write an op-ed in a newspaper and I hope politicians will pick it up. And I guess you share this experience. It's very frustrating. And at some point, again, it was an experience I had during a talk at the Ministry of Justice, I think in the Netherlands, about 10 years ago already, no, 7 years ago, when somebody came to me after the talk and said to me, yeah, we know you're right, but implementing this would be political suicide. And this is what I've heard also from politicians later, which made me increasingly skeptical that we can really achieve something as social scientists by just talking truth to power, as Edward Said would call he said the real purpose of the academic, the public intellectual, is to talk truth to power. Noam Chomsky responded to that, well, that is pretty pointless because power already knows the truth. And that has been increasingly also my conviction, really. For instance, talking about external border policies in the EU, I will talk about this later, for the last 30 years, people basically are ignorant of the evidence, don't want to know the evidence or distort it completely or ignore it. They cherry pick evidence at best, at worst, it's outright propaganda. And that is really why I decided to write the book, because there is so much knowledge on migration. We can talk about a century of migration scholarship, and not much of that enters the public debate. So here is the book. And I'm very happy. I hope you allow me a very little ego trip. These are the covers of the books that have already been translated. And there's even a Greek version coming now. So I'm extremely pleased. I could have never expected this to be the result, because I was hoping to at least get it out in English. I never expected this outcome. Now, I wrote this book indeed out of a strong feeling of urgency, because this level of polarization, as we can see in politics around us, is becoming dangerous and completely toxic, with a growing normalization of inflammatory far-right rhetoric and politicians. And we urgently need a new vision on migration based on facts rather than fears, based on evidence rather than ideology. And what I'm trying to do in the book is to equip readers with insights on dynamics, causes, impacts of migration based on the best scientific insights. So this is not only based on my own 30-year sort of research in migration, but also on the broader perspectives I developed with colleagues, particularly at the International Migration Institute, but also in many chapters on topics I'm not an expert in. I really draw on the literature, basically. So I really try to summarize a lot of what's around. I was also asked, before I'm going to present a little bit about the substance of my book, about the writing process, because I got quite some questions that would be interesting to tell you something about why did you make the choices in terms of how you wrote your book and how you structured your book. And yeah, writing this general audience book is a huge challenge, because the real challenge is how do you communicate scientific insights to a general audience. But what I found more important in a way, how do you reach readers across ideological divides? Because I had the feeling that within the sort of research community, we mainly communicate to people within our own silo, also politically, and it is not very effective. Also, because the more research I did, I was also becoming convinced that also on the left-wing side, there are quite some myths about migration. I kind of decided to look critically at both sides of the debate, both the anti and the pro side, both on the left and the right-wing side. And of course, the biggest challenge here is how to be nuanced, because we are social scientists, but also be a bit ruthless in the sense you'd still want to be clear. So I'm sure some of the panelists will not be happy with everything I've written down, but in a way, you have to simplify things if you talk to a larger audience. More concentrating on what I think we do know than talking about what we don't know. What I try to do is to connect with readers' real experiences by introducing stories, examples, and not only the good experiences, but also some more negative experiences people may have with migration. And by challenging indeed right and left-wing myths about migration. Another choice I had to make, and that was a tough one, is to avoid some politically correct terminology that may be quite alienating. For instance, I do talk about illegal migration and not irregular migration, because for the average reader, it creates a huge distance already. What are you talking about? And I know the debates, but these are the tough choices I sometimes had to make. I didn't try to impose personal opinions like, oh, diversity is fantastic, or you have to accept diversity because that's how it is. And of course, clear writing, no jargon and use of metaphors. And although my book is quite thick, I tried to write it up, and I did it deliberately in short chapters, so it can be read on a train ride or on a metro ride. It was really what I had in mind. So that was a bit what I tried to do. And this leads to, I'm not going to read this whole table, these 22 myths. This is really how I try to build up the book. Myths about the nature of migration, and the causes of migration in the first part, then the second part about the impacts of migration, and the last part is much more about the political discourse, the propaganda, and how that differs from the reality and about migration policies. But it is not just a public book. What I'm also trying to do is using those myths as hooks to tell a more overarching story, and to basically present a scientific paradigm on migration that reflects decades of fundamental research done by migration researchers around the world. And that is really the ideas we also developed in Oxford with Stephen Castles. Already 18 years ago, we started that journey, is to really reconceptualize migration as an intrinsic part of broader processes of social transformation, rather than this problem to be solved or a solution to problems, which is very much part of the political discourse, but it has even filtered into quite some academic discourse. And this is how I visualize this to students, and it's the only sort of a student slide I will include in this presentation, is that migration is but one part of a much broader complex of changes. And this later on will also be useful to think about what does policy actually mean and how much difference can policy actually make if we understand the bigger driving forces of migration. Well, I will try now to illustrate the main story of my book and what I'm trying to say in the book by highlighting a few main myths. And I will try to give you a sort of the essence of the book. And the first is this very common idea, and this is actually an idea that is pretty much shared all across the board, that migration is at an all-time high and accelerating fast. It is the idea that growing inequality, poverty, warfare, combined with better infrastructure for communication and transport, has led to a rapid acceleration of world migration. And often we hear the notion of a migration crisis, both on the left and on the right. They may have very different solutions, and I'm going to talk about those perceived solutions. But the idea is this increasing pressure on the outside borders, for instance, of the European Union. And some very serious social scientists like Paul Collier, famous development economists, have written books with these kind of titles. So this is not just far right-wing propaganda. It's quite broadly shared idea that the third world is emptying out on the so-called first world. And of course, maps produced by agencies like Frontex add to this idea that migration is almost this invasion, that Europe is being besieged by a growing wave of irregular migrants coming to Europe. When we look at the evidence, things at least become a little bit more complex, because it's easy to believe, because all of these factors, more and more people will be on the move in the world. Well, this is a simple graph of the number of international migrants in the world, and we indeed see a very fast increase over the last 60 to 70 years. But if we express this number as the percentage of world population, we get quite a different picture. That international migrants are roughly 3% of the world population, and it was roughly the case in 1960. So it is not really about global levels of movements that have really changed. Other things are going on. And what has been going on is that from a European perspective, from a Eurocentric perspective, the geography of world migration has completely changed as a result of the changing place of Europe on the global migration map. Because it were, of course, Europeans who for centuries, 4 to 5 centuries, moved to other continents as colonists, soldiers, enslavers, missionaries, settlers, and as ordinary migrants. And of course, Europeans didn't ask permission to do so. So from that perspective, we can call European colonization the biggest illegal migration in human history. And unlike migration nowadays, this was an invasion, as Europeans did come with weapons and gunboats. But what has happened since the Second World War, with decolonization, economic growth, and demographic changes in Europe, and increasing labor demand, particularly in lower skilled jobs, is that Europe has transformed from a continent of out-migration to a continent of in-migration. And that has been, of course, a real change from a European perspective. I'll get back to that later, but just a few things about refugees. If you look at long-term refugee trends, because many people argue that refugee numbers have gone up, we actually see it is a very erratic pattern. This is refugee movement since 1977, but it's going up and down and up and down and up and down. There is no long-term increase. The same if you look, for instance, in the Netherlands. If we see where most refugees live, 80 to 85% of refugees are in neighboring countries. Turkey is the single biggest refugee hosting country in the world because it's a neighboring nation of Syria. And that percentage is actually not changing much. So it's not true that increasing hordes of refugees are moving towards Europe. Most people want to stay close to home, and that is still the thing. What about illegal migration? That is another perception. We get this through media, that more and more people try to come to Europe, for instance, from Africa. But actually, irregular migration, illegal migration, you see I'm struggling with the terms, is much smaller than we often think. In my book, I estimated that 9 out of 10 Africans that move to Europe do so legally with passports and visas in hand. So yeah, it is a problem, and bad things happen at the border, but it is not as massive as many people imagine. Now, going back to the changing place of Europe, this is sort of the overview of world migration. Still, the large majority of people in the world, 83%, don't migrate, and the large majority of migrants move within countries. The number of internal rural to urban migrants in China is actually higher than the total number of international migrants in the world. It's an important reminder that most movement happens within countries. And migrants is 3% of the world population and refugees 0.3%. So actually a tiny sliver of total mobility. And this map is also in my book, and why I inserted this map is to show that world migration is anything but this big move from south to north, with most people moving within regions, within continents, and actually transcontinental movements being relatively limited. So we cannot talk about an exodus, we cannot talk about an invasion, but what is changing then? That is that reversal, that Europe, from a European perspective, has become a destination continent. And this is a graph that shows the proportion of Europeans in total transcontinental migration movement that has been plummeting because Europeans basically have stopped migrating in big numbers to the Americas or to other regions in the world. And it's been Asians, Latin Americans, and Africans that have increasingly entered the global migration stage. Now, if you look at Europe, the top line is yearly inflows into the European Union, as if Europe were a country. And that has really increased fast. And in last decades, total immigration to the European Union is roughly 2.5 million. That is, of course, a real change. And of course, it has created a lot of political debates about those countries becoming de facto countries of destination, but it has nothing to do with global migration running out of hand. So the global migration reversal is the real change. And from a Eurocentric perspective, it seems, of course, a real life-changing phenomenon. Another myth is that border restrictions reduce migration. It seems very commonsensical, like a no-brainer, as we call it, right? You make it more difficult to cross a border, so less people will come. And it seems to underlie a lot of the policies that we right now see around the world, with those fences, for instance, the Spanish enclave of Melilla on the northern Moroccan coast. But this is not how migration works. Because if you really want to understand the effect of borders on migration, you will have to understand how it affects people's decision-making around migration, about when, where, and how to migrate, but also how it affects the total process of migration, which we call circulation. We're always focused on the number of people coming. We don't think about how does it affect people's return migration decisions. And that partly explains why border restrictions have quite some unintended effects that can counteract border policies or actually make them completely counterproductive. Talking about Fortress Europe, we already talk about 33 years of Fortress Europe, started in 1991 with the introduction of visa requirements by Southern European countries for North Africans. And this is the latest stage, celebrating 33 years of Fortress Europe. Now, if you take a long-term perspective, you cannot but conclude it has been a complete failure. We have seen migration deals for the last 33 years. It has not really resulted in less migration. It had all sorts of effects that were not desired, but partly explained why migration continued. Partly we talk about migration going underground and an increased reliance on smuggling. So smuggling is not the cause of illegal migration, it's a reaction to border controls. We see increased risks and cost of passing. This is a map of the number of border deaths measured. This is the most deadly border in the world, the Mediterranean. We also know what we call in the Netherlands the waterbed effect. So border controls have led to this huge diversification of migration routes and this constant cat and mouse game almost between smugglers and border controls. You can cut off flows from one particular part, but then people will start migrating to other routes. And again, we talk about 33 years of this cat and mouse game. But perhaps more importantly, because the debate is so focused on illegal migration, is the effect of border restrictions on regular migration flows. And one example is so-called preemptive migration surges. And perhaps the best example is the independence of Suriname. Surinamese independence was partly motivated in the fact that the Dutch government put so much pressure behind it to stop free migration of Dutch citizens before decolonization to the Netherlands. It was only possible by de-Dutchifying the Surinamese to stop them from coming freely. Now, what did many Surinamese think? It is now or it is never. And before independence, around independence, and before the introduction of visas in 1980, roughly 40% of the entire Surinamese population migrated to the Netherlands. We have many more of these examples. Same for Commonwealth migrants to the United Kingdom, decided to stay when it became more difficult and got their family members over. We have seen similar dynamics, perhaps less strongly so, but also with the guest worker migration. But I think that brings me to the next one, and this is perhaps the most important one. I'm talking about how I try to use also metaphors in my book. I tend to compare free migration with a revolving door. So free migration within countries, or like within the European, people go back and forth, pick up a job, studying, often going back once the goal has been achieved. What typically happens with border restrictions is that this pattern of circulation gets interrupted. And together with Matthias Tsaika, one of my colleagues, we wrote a paper where we did econometric analysis, where we tried to estimate the effect of the introduction of a visa on inflows and return flows. And what we found on the average is indeed a visa on average on the longer term reduces inflows by 67%. But it reduces return flows even by a greater number. In other words, you interrupt circulation. You may end up with higher net migration, the famous migratiesaldo in Dutch, and that is the big paradox. So we can see those effects in practice as well. And here is the example of Morocco, where I spent most of my research years. Moroccans before 1991 would just hop on the ferry to Spain to work there for a few months or years, and they would go back. You only needed a passport. In 1991, Spain introduced visas. 15 years later, 1 million Moroccans were living permanently in Spain because it became more expensive to migrate, either legally or illegally, and the more difficult it is to come, the more migrants tend to stay. You can also see that here's a graph of total African migration to the European Union. You see an increasing difference between the number of people coming in and people going back. And it exactly shows what we showed with this other study, that you interrupt circulation and you end up with higher numbers of migrants than you would have wanted. That brings me to the last myth, because perhaps you can say border restrictions is this idea that comes mostly from the political right. Political left say, no, we have to solve it differently. We have to make sure poor people no longer have to migrate. That is the only way to stop migration. And it is linked to images of migration as a desperate flight of misery from poor countries, and we have to do something about it. It's also built into narratives of politicians. Here, the Dutch Minister for Development Cooperation, Liliane Ploemen from the Labour Party, telling, don't tell me that young Africans would not rather build a good future on the continent than face an uncertain future as sunglass peddlers in Europe. I'm not going to make any comments about the quite condescending nature of this statement, but it was linked to a proposal to help African countries so that people no longer had to migrate. When I was doing research in Morocco, I already stumbled upon the paradox that whilst economic growth has been quite spectacular actually in Morocco, that emigration only increased. And I couldn't really explain that. And that made me think about how can I get my head around this? And if you look within Africa, you see that most Africans migrate within the continent. And that most migration to Europe or the United States is actually from the relatively wealthy, stable countries, like in the Maghreb region or Ghana or South Africa, to give a few examples. That made me discover a whole literature, and here's the example of the founder of that literature, Wilbert Zielinski, in 1971 already wrote an article about the mobility transition, who argued that development and modernization actually lead to more people moving around. And that inspired me to test this with global data. And what I did is made distinction between 5 groups of countries ranging from very low levels of human development to very high levels of human development, and I tried to calculate averages in terms of numbers of immigrants. Well, that shows a very intuitive picture, that the more developed the country, the higher the percentage of the population is a migrant. The 15% on the right-hand bar is exactly where we're at in the Netherlands or in the United States, in terms of 15% of our population is a migrant. The surprise is in the following. It is the middle-income countries that have highest immigration rates, not the poorest countries. So if you were indeed to think that development leads to less migration, no. Between that trajectory from low to middle income, you can actually expect an increase in mobility. And it questions almost everything many people think about migration. It questions the whole push-pull framework because it doesn't fit into that framework. And that's why I also tried to argue in the book, we need a different way of thinking about migration to understand that. And I proposed this model also in the book, which I developed in my scientific publications, but I also advocate in the book. If we think about migration as a sort of function of aspirations and capabilities, we can actually understand this better. Because migration is expensive. So if you acquire more resources, your likelihood to be able to migrate over long distances is higher. If you acquire more education, your aspirations, but also your ideas about the good life, are more likely going to change in such ways that you imagine your future to be either in the city or in some faraway country. And this is partly why the higher educated actually move more, and why migration is quite a selective process. This is a much more complicated story than I can tell here, but it clearly upsets lots of commonsensical assumptions about migration. What do we do with this information? Well, the road ahead. And I put it here on purpose because, yes, we can say what's wrong and what we don't know and what myths we are busting. And in my book, I really also try to see how myths are wrong, but I also try to explain how it then indeed works. Just myth busting doesn't work. You also have to tell a story. So what do we need to do in terms of the debate? That's a very good question. First of all, we have to talk about the things we don't talk about. certainly politicians don't talk much about, because they represent migration either as this desperate flight from misery of refugees or a kind of this invasion that we have to stop. What they don't talk about is, oh, there's one slide, I wasn't here, the elephant in the room of the migration debate, and that is labor demand. A common other myth is that immigrants steal jobs and drive down wages. You know the story. But actually the real causality is the other way around. Immigration is a reaction to labor shortages. Migrants come to fill vacancies rather than that they cause unemployment and wage stagnation. It's the exact other way around of the political narrative. And it is also proven just looking at simple data. This is one graph from the Netherlands. The blue line is unemployment in the Netherlands, unemployment rate, and the red line is non-asylum related migration. And you see an inversely proportional relationship. Very simply meant, if unemployment is high, the economy is doing bad, not many migrants come, the net migration may even be negative. If labor shortages are high, like they are right now, lots of migrants will be coming. And that is the real logic. It's the inverse logic of what politicians will tell us. So from that perspective, by far the best way to stop immigration is to wreck the economy. But of course, that's not what we want. And that leads us to the real policy conundrum of which we are part. Migration is not something that we can turn off and on like a tap, and this is how politicians tend to talk about migration. And we don't talk indeed about this elephant in the room, which is this, and here's the slide, which is the labor demand factor, which is very important. It's not the only factor, but it is systematically ignored in political decisions. Yes, migrants do move away because they face difficulties back home, even if they had resources, but most migrants wouldn't make that move if there were no real opportunities. That is the story. And the best illustration of that is the Brexit, because the Brexit was meant as this stop on free migration from the European Union, and it seemed logically consistent. You can be in favor or against Brexit, but certainly it made an end to free mobility from European citizens. But it did not make an end to labor demand. And here's what happened. Whilst David Cameron promised to keep migration under the 100,000 threshold, after Brexit, it shot up to 750,000. Partly because Eastern Europeans decided to stay and not to return, the interruption of circulation, partly because labor demand was still there, and simply workers, for instance, in the healthcare sector, were no longer coming from Europe, but now, for instance, from India or Ghana or Nigeria. So it didn't, of course, stop migration. And the employers, of course, were under pressure to allow this. And I think the best example of this organized hypocrisy is the extraordinarily low labor enforcement rates, workplace enforcement rates, like controls whether migrants are working illegally in your enterprise. Some data we looked up were really shocking when I found out the real numbers. In the United States and in the United Kingdom, the number of employers that gets actually prosecuted on a yearly basis for employing undocumented migrants is somewhere between 10 and 20, which is absolutely laughable and actually quite similar to the chance of being struck by lightning. Hence the photo. So that shows really, we talk tough about immigration, but in reality, we face a totally different situation. And that is also illustrated by research we've done as part of the Debunking project in Oxford. We measured immigration policies and how restrictive they were. And we actually, what we discovered, Katarina is in the room, I co-wrote the paper with her and Matthias Tsaika. We discovered there hardly any significant difference between the right and the left wing in terms of policies that are actually implemented on the ground. And for instance, right-wing parties may talk tough on immigration, but there fees pressure from employers to either let more legal migrants in or indeed to turn a blind eye towards the exploitation of undocumented migrant workers. And everybody knows this. And this, I think, beautiful illustration in The Economist recently shows that the double messaging also Europe is sending towards people who want to cross borders, because everybody knows that for an average Moroccan, Tunisian or Senegalese migrant who arrives at the other side of the border, there are jobs, and this is largely being tolerated. And this is where I end my book with. There is no simple solutions. There is a fundamental trilemma, and here I partly base myself on the political science literature on migration, between three different political objectives that liberal democracies face. On the one hand, we have to respect a number of fundamental human rights, which limits our ability to stop migration, to not allow people to join their family members, or indeed not to grant asylum to asylum seekers who manage to find their way to Europe. On the other hand, we have this economic lobby, the economic interest in openness and competitiveness, the deregularized labor market, and at the same time we want less immigration. Assuming we still want to stay a liberal democracy, it is really that dilemma between economic openness and wanting to have less immigration. And there you see the complete split in which political parties find themselves. In other words, they can't have their cake and eat it too. And what it also really shows is that a real debate on migration, as I conclude my book, is a debate about the kind of labor markets we want to have, about the kind of economies, about inequality, about labor, about the kind of society we want to live in. Thank you very much.
So we're very lucky to have found 3 colleagues who could make time to read the book and think it through and share their thoughts with us today. Let me very briefly introduce them to you. Özge Bilgili is an interdisciplinary social scientist at the University of Utrecht. She's worked on a very wide range of topics in the field of migration studies, ranging from education and how migrant youth is doing in education, to anti-discrimination policies, to migration trajectories, to also protests and the representation of people with migration backgrounds. Özge is a member of the Utrecht Young Academy and one of the founders of the wonderful social initiative Parents Across Borders. Then there's Jeroen, sitting next to Özge. Jeroen Domernik is a political scientist, a colleague of mine here at the University of Amsterdam, who has a very long career of working on migration politics mostly, but also beyond on issues of why and with what consequences people migrate, both at the European, local and municipal levels. Your experience, Jeroen, includes a brief spell as a senior policy advisor in the Ministry of the Interior in the Netherlands. And also, since then, you've spent, I think, a lot of time and a lot of experience on interacting with policymakers in different kinds of forms and formats. Then finally, there's Jan-Willem Duivendak, all the way to my left, who is a sociologist here at the University of Amsterdam and who is the director of the Netherlands Institutes of Advanced Studies. More recently, Jan-Willem's work focuses on belonging, on constructions and politics of home, and on nativism. And also, Jan-Willem is someone who I think I can say that you position yourself as a public intellectual, can I put it that way? A public sociologist, certainly someone who takes up an active role in public debate, who's written many essays, opinion pieces, and also books in Dutch. And so I'm really curious to know how you read Hein's book. Özge, could I ask you to start?
Hello, everyone. Dear Hein, it's been wonderful to see how your decades of work has come together in this book. And your presentation also took me to many years ago in Maastricht, I have to say, during my PhD, when I also had lectures from you. Funny enough, I've been actually using the migration myths in my own courses. And I think it's been one of the best conversation starters when it comes to courses on Introduction to Migration Studies. So I use it in, for example, our research master program on migration, ethnic relations, and multiculturalism. I see some alumni here, which is really nice. I also use it in my courses within the interdisciplinary honors program, where I don't only have social scientists in the class, but also have students studying physics, computation science, sustainable development. And I also engage in these migration myths with policymakers and practitioners coming from all over the world when I give trainings on migration management. And they come from anywhere from the world, ranging from Colombia to Nigeria to Lebanon, say. And I think it's remarkable like how every single time these migration myths lead to such eye-opening and provocative discussions among these people coming from such different backgrounds. So I think it's really nice. And one of the observations I have is that once we start debunking some of these myths in the class, you know, both the students and the participants kind of sit differently, you know, and they become more curious. And I love that feeling. And I think, Hein, you have like managed to create that curiosity at a national, almost like international level now. And I think it's great to see that there's such much more awareness, knowledge, and curiosity on more critical discussions on international migration. And that's wonderful. But also, of course, I have a couple of minutes, which I would like to also take the chance to ask you a couple of questions. And much of the literature that you've used in your book is also the type of literature that helped me kind of shape my own academic identity. So I thought, okay, let me just take this chance to also ask you a question where I grapple with myself for many years still. And in your book, you rightfully, of course, present migration as a social phenomenon, right? So like from the perspective of academics, it's an analytical concept that we try to study, right? We are interested in understanding migration dynamics, its causes and consequences. And one of the core messages of your book is also that migration has a normative side to it, right? So it's a social reality that we need to manage through policies that are at the local, national, and international levels. But there is a side to it that I miss a bit. And I think that's really important to recognize that migration is also a lived experience. And I think it's primarily because it's such a lived experience from a personal perspective that it becomes such an emotional and controversial topic. So as much as one can present a holistic view that is non-alarming with regards to international migration, there will still be some who will think that, yeah, but I do see it as an alarming issue, nevertheless. And I think there are many reasons why this could be the case. And I will touch upon one factor that can explain this, perhaps. And this is something that you cover in your work as well. So I think that's a nice connection. So you rightfully discussed in some of the chapters that migration doesn't benefit everyone in the same way, right? Some benefit from migration, others don't. There are people under certain conditions who are indeed, in reality, negatively get impacted by migration, or maybe not to say migration, but maybe better way of saying it, from poorly managed migration, right? So that's a reality. And you end one of the chapters with that statement, which I find as a very important point of starting a conversation. You say, well, ordinary citizens have a good reason to ask, what's in it for me? And that I find very interesting and I want to ask you, my question to you is, how do you then reconcile this tension, this difference between this global holistic view that is non-alarming, so to say, and the infinitely different experiences that people have on the ground in their individual lives because of the social, economic, cultural situations that they find themselves in, right? And maybe you can reflect on that tension of it. And we as migration scholars, how should we navigate that interaction between the individual level, the meso level, and the macro level? So I'm really curious to hear what you think about that. And I know that I have only 5 minutes, so I have one more question. And I think that also relates to one of your main messages, which you also concluded with, is that we need to think about the society in which we want to live in, right? And I think that's a very important remark. But my question to you, I was very curious, and I kind of have a sense, but I'm curious to hear who your audience is then. Who is the we in your discussions? And I find it extremely important that we have open and truly inclusive discussions when it comes to this question of like what kind of a society we want to live in. And in my view, it is extremely important that the migrants themselves are part of that conversation, right? But in the face of the discrimination, the othering processes, discrimination, all these negative experiences that migrants have, how can we ensure that they feel like they're equal members of the society so that they become also part of the conversation? So I'm really curious about how you navigate these challenges. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Hein Haas reminds me of Gerard Reven, who's long dead. But Gerard Reven had one ambition in his life, is to write the ultimate book, the book that made all other books superfluous. And sad to say, he didn't manage. However, Hein did. Because I think he is done us a huge favor by writing this book and actually summarizing all the findings that are out there in the academic world. And doing this in a way, he gets in the footsteps of Hans van Amersfoort, whom we both knew well. and he actually was the person who wrote about the Surinamese exodus and why this happened. And this really was, for me, a pivotal moment in my academic career, because he put me in the place to study, you know, on the one hand, what migration is really about and what governments think it's about and how these truths don't match. And that's what turned me into a political scientist. So that makes this book extremely important, and big compliments and a big thank you, Hein, for doing this, for writing the book that makes all other books, including my own, superfluous. However, there's one thing you say in the road ahead, so the very end of the book, in which you say, well, you know, asylum policies should include return of people who are deemed not to be refugees. This in itself, of course, you cannot disagree with, I guess. But it's also something that our policy people agree with, or they don't disagree with. They always keep saying, you know, you should actually have an effective return policy for those people who are not deemed fit to be here. And this, of course, is a very thorny, problematic issue. It's very difficult to make people go away, especially if they had to invest to get here in the first place. Also something that Hein very much underlines. But now what we see is a political reality emerging where this ambition of actually making people return will maybe become real, because the new pact on asylum and migration includes the idea of having a border regime, where people who try to enter Europe seeking asylum or something else will be detained for a maximum of 3 months, if I'm not mistaken, to establish their identity. And this, of course, is crucial. If you want to make people go back, you need to know who they are, where they're from, what their citizenship is. And it also includes thoughts about actually then making third countries responsible, because the third country that people came through in order to enter in this detention center can also be made responsible for taking these people in. And only if you come from a country where the recognition rate for asylum seekers is something like 20 or 30%, I keep forgetting, then you have instant access to the EU territory in order to await the outcome of your asylum request. So this is going to be a very nasty border regime, I can predict you. And it will be very much like we've seen on Lesbos, for instance, where people were detained for a very long time in very dire circumstances. So the policy people, in a sense, do listen to what Hein proposes, to have a very good return regime. But I'm pretty sure that this is not really what Hein was meaning when he wrote this down. So Hein, maybe you want to comment on this later on. And there's also a small issue, but maybe I don't have the time for this. 2 minutes. I'm personally very much interested in the Temporary Protection Directive that's being applied to the Ukrainians. And the Dutch government gives its very own perspective on this. It's really aimed at keeping people in a limbo situation for a very long time. Most European countries interpreted the Temporary Protection Directive as something that actually could lead to integration and a more permanent stay, or also maybe a return situation, like within the freedom of movement for EU citizens is the case. Whereas in the Dutch case, this is not envisaged. These people are not issued a residence permit. They're simply in a kind of a tolerated status where they are allowed to work. Half of them do. So in a sense, you could say this is also a work regime, a labor immigration regime hidden under the Temporary Protection Directive. And now the government is proposing that maybe we should again have an extension of the Temporary Protection Directive with another year, maybe another 2 years, maintaining people in limbo. And this is so much reminds me of the guest worker era, the 1970s, where it always was very much ambivalent about what we actually wanted that these people would do. Yes, they go back. The Surinamese would even go back at some point. The Turks would go back, the Moroccans would go back, and of course they didn't. And therefore, you know, Hein, maybe you would like to draw a few more parallels between the guest worker era and what we see with the Temporary Protection Directive. Thank you so much.
Hi, thanks for inviting me to share some observations on this very important book. very important book. I think we barely have to say here that you really have to read it if you not already did it. It teaches many lessons. It is already impactful. I have to say it's a very fair book. It's a very nuanced book, actually. One of the things we always teach our students, I think, is that they should do the reading for the best, right? That never give a false portray of your enemy, but make your enemies as strong as possible. And that's actually what Hein is doing in this book. And I think that makes it a very fair book. And it also shows, or try to show, it is very reflexive on the question, how to be a scholar on a highly politicized field. And in that way, it directly and indirectly also really stimulates to think, to reflect on the relation between scholarship on the one hand and politics on the other hand. So I come back to that. I have to say, I was somewhat surprised when I saw the book coming out. Hein was at NIAS when he was writing the book, so I was not really involved, but he was reporting on the book. He was struggling in those days a bit with what is the story I want to tell. And I have to say, I was really surprised to see that it was about myth busting, debunking, because when Hein arrived at NIAS, he said, "Oh, I will never ever debunk anymore." But that's exactly what this is, the most debunking book you can imagine. So what happened? What happened? Given the genesis or the origins of the book? Well, one of the things I think that might have happened is that there's a change of audience, right? There's a change in audience. At least you want ordinary citizens, as you call the we, to read it. Well, I think actually that you're still addressing very much, or I hope actually that you are also read by policymakers, journalists, but also people from NGOs. And even though I know it has been translated in many languages and already many people are reading, perhaps it's overly optimistic really to reach out to lay people, right? I mean, I'm not sure whether that should be the ambition, but for sure they can perhaps be allies when finally journalists and policymakers really get to understand what migration is about. I have two remarks, basically, one regarding your strategy and one regarding the goal of the book. The strategy. So what Hein is doing mostly what he is doing is giving facts, right? It is also the language he was speaking during the presentation. But I think it is somewhat ambivalent, actually, what you are doing. So what is your strategy to convince people? It's not just about facts. Well, sometimes in the book it says facts speak for themselves. But actually, I think you don't want to say that, because you also say that you need a narrative to make sense of the facts. So I think it would be good if you can somewhat elaborate on the question, what is the status of facts and how positivist are you, right? In the sense, do facts speak for themselves, or do you really need more of a narrative? Or are you proudly positivist, which is a possible position, of course, but I would be a little bit surprised if that would be your position. The good thing of when I was reading it, I was thinking, what kind of narrative then is Hein using? And he doesn't make that explicit, but if you compare the type of narratives he is attacking and he is using himself, developing himself, I would say you have a far more long-term perspective. You take it from various angles, and therefore it's far more nuanced than, for instance, the short-term kind of interest-driven narratives by politicians. But it can be interesting, at least for us here, to hear more about what are the elements and dimensions of the narratives that are convincing in your perspectives, and what do narratives more than facts, just facts, do. And one remark there, the position of other scholars is not very clear. Actually, well, you are citing other scholars, but mostly scholars you agree with, or they agree with you. But there are not many scholars in the book you don't agree with. That can be a choice, right? Not to be polemical. I'm always overly polemical. Don't be that. But not really addressing other scholars who also have those factual claims, right, is a bit strange. So in the discussion about how diverse is our world, or was the Netherlands ever multicultural in terms of policies, there are abstract enemies, but I think mostly those things, those ideas are also propagated by our colleagues wrongly so, but they do, right? So why are they missing there? So why are there not that many scholars you disagree with? The other remark has to do with the goal. Hein really wants the public debate, the political debate, to calm down, right? He literally writes, don't panic is not necessary. Don't panic anymore. Stop the politicization of this issue, which I found on this field extremely very good idea. But there seems for him to be a causal link between having more respect for the facts and calming down. But I wonder whether that's true for other fields as well. If you think about, for instance, climate change or global warming, I think there the problem is really totally different. So where here sociologists are the type of people who calm down and say it will be fine, and in the long term migrants will integrate, right? That is the type of role we play on this field. Regarding this theme, our colleagues working on global warming also want to have more respect for the facts, but for exactly the other goal, to politicize, to politicians finally hurry up, to take it more seriously as it is. So it raises some questions, comparative questions regarding different fields. What is the role of having stronger narrative on facts in relation to types of politicization? So perhaps not a question to politicize or not to politicize, but what type of politicization do we want? What type of emotions, right? Because just to say, well, it shouldn't be so emotional. Well, on your field, yes, perhaps it should be less emotional, right? But that's not, I guess, your overall claim. It really might depend on the field. Thanks.
Thanks for your positive words. Really touching. Really appreciate it. For being here and giving those comments. But let me focus on the questions, because starting with Özge, how do I reconcile this global view, which is perhaps also linking to what Jan Willem was saying about calm down, there's no reason for panic, with the lived experiences of migrants? I try to address that in some of the chapters, like the chapter on migration doesn't lift all boats, where I quite strongly argue, and also in my conclusion, that the main benefits of migration, certainly the main economic benefits of migration, go to the already affluent in societies, and that those people who don't benefit from migration economically, the lowest income earners, including ex-migrants, live in exactly in those places where issues of segregation and other problems may pop up. And so in that sense, it's very logical. There's a fairly large group around that say, well, what's in it for me? So I try to address that, but I've heard this more often, that perhaps I could have addressed more the real experiences of migrants and of non-migrants who are confronted with migration. Try to do it in a few chapters, but I could have done that perhaps more. The book was already quite big, so it's perhaps also been a choice, but I definitely think more needs to be told about exploitation of migrant workers, for instance, what it means if you suffer on the European border. That number that I show about this laughably low number of employees that gets prosecuted also means that we collectively tolerate huge exploitation of migrant workers, where you could say that immigration restrictions are not so much about stopping migration, but about legitimizing institutionally the exclusion of rights of workers. So we're basically facilitating the exploitation of workers. And there's a direct line to colonial practices of Europeans with the control of mobility and the control of workers, often migrant workers within our former colonial empires, and what we do right now. And we are very happily pointing the finger to the Gulf countries, how much they exploit migrants. But actually a lot of exploitations going on in Europe, also amongst legal migrant workers, because they simply don't have many rights. So I think that's a fair point you make. And certainly in future work, I would like to address this more. But yeah, in a way, this was more focused indeed on the surface level observations people make about migration, and indeed busting the big stories. But I agree with that on you. Then on your question, what kind of society we want to live in and who is the audience, and that migrants need to be part of that experience. Yeah, definitely. What I try to highlight Also in the chapters where I highlighted migration is not a solution and that the benefits of migration only go to a particular section of the population that is already better off, is that, yeah, we have different experiences of immigration. That was exactly what I tried to say, but perhaps it didn't come through loudly enough in the book. But at least in the conclusion, I tried to address this somehow by saying, well, a real debate about immigration is in the end a debate about labor, about inequality, about restoring the dignity of manual labor, for instance, which is a broader debate also in Dutch society. And of course, it's very attractive for politicians to say, well, you have bad rights or low pay because of immigration, whereas of course it's been a result more of economic policy than anything else. So migrants and migration more generally continues to be scapegoated. But definitely I think we need more attention for those different lived experiences. And it was quite late in my book that I developed those narratives about, you know, the other side of migration, but I definitely think it needs more attention and about how exploitation really works and what it means in terms of suffering. Also, I think in terms of public education, a lot can be done. So thank you. Jeroen, what can I say? I'm not Gerard Reven, but compliment is taken. It was definitely lament is the last word. And it kind of foreshadows a little bit, but I'll come back to that later, what Jan Willem was saying, is that I tried as best as I can to summarize what we kind of seem to know, although we may disagree on some things. The tendency, particularly in the postmodern era, is for us to emphasize what we don't know. And I still like doing research, and I'm still embarking upon new research projects where we study things we are very unsure about and really need to take the next step. But perhaps we are no longer used to also just write up what we know. And I know all the epistemological, ontological problems. I'm aware of that. I know that objective truth doesn't exist and truth is being perceived from many different angles, but some things are real. And I sometimes struggle with this overly postmodern self-doubt because I'm super confident to say that 33 years of external border policies have been a complete failure if the goal was to stop migration. The facts are on the ground. Or that migrants are being exploited. Yes, I think that's an objective fact. It's not a political statement. So here I think social scientists, if they want to communicate better to a larger audience, sometimes also need to go over that inhibition a little bit, to let go. We have debates within academia, very good debates, to really put ourselves up to a very high standard in terms of not making all sort of wild claims. But I think when we communicate to a broader audience, we at least need to try, I think, to communicate what we do know, rather surely, let me put it that way. Jeroen Dominic, so the road ahead and an asylum policy. Yeah, that was not what I was trying to say. I think it is exactly what you said about the limbo situation, that I think if you want to understand why things went wrong in the past with the so-called guest workers, was this lack of recognition that their populations were here to stay. I remind this famous phrase of Max Frisch, who said, "We wanted workers, we got people instead." And I think that story seems to be repeated again and again and again. And we may talk about, in 20 years, about failed integration of Polish migrant workers living in some The Hague neighborhoods. But I think the same applies for asylum seekers. The refusal to allow asylum seekers to work, the limbo zones in which we put them for very long, don't solve any problems, because we know fairly surely about quite some big groups that we refuse relatively quick access to refugee status, which would allow them to become part of society, that we leave them in limbo zones for political reasons, even if we actually know we cannot send them back. And so you better then recognize those groups and allow them to work and become part of society. And I think particularly in Northwestern Europe, we've done really poorly in that sense, both indeed with the former guest workers, new groups of migrant workers of whom we deny systematically their existence even. I was shocked when I heard Lodewijk Asscher, quite a prominent Labour politician, almost deny that there is a demand for migrant workers in the Netherlands and that we can just think it away, like the Socialist Party is doing. That is another form of denial. I also think we need to be critical towards employers that say, oh, we need more migrant workers. I think we need a more broader debate about what kind of work do we want. And that brings me back to this broader issue. So that is not what I tried to say, but to be really honest with you, I also wanted to acknowledge that we cannot have a functioning refugee recognition system, which needs to be fair, but also in a way efficient, so that good decisions can be made on a relatively short term. Because leaving people in limbo means they will stay forever, and then we better recognize that. On the European Migration Pact, I'm extremely cynical this is ever going to work, because it is based first of all on the presumption of European solidarity in this very harsh policy, with all the countries already talking about buying out their share. I'm very cynical, but I think the biggest reason is that it somehow assumes we can turn Europe into North Korea, that we really can fence off the external border. And that is exactly what we've seen over the last 33 years. We talk about 44,000 kilometers of Mediterranean coast. We are not Australia. We have a completely different geopolitical situation. I think it's insane if you define insanity as trying to do more of the same and expect different results. So I don't think this has any credibility. This is only for political consumption. Just today, there was a new migration agreement with Egypt, buying of dictators for some money, officially to stop illegal migration. But I no longer believe that politicians even believe that themselves. It's just to make a strong impression. It's failed for the last 33 years. I don't see why it would be. These are acts of strong political showmanship that conceal the real nature of immigration policy, in which we allow those workers in which undocumented migrants can work and do get exploited European labor markets. So I don't think this policy will work, but I do agree with you that it is pretty horrible in terms of how it affects the real lives, coming back to Özge's point, of people who try to cross borders. And that, I think, needs to be emphasized more. Jan Willem, what is my strategy? I'm not sure, perhaps I've said it, but I'm sure I have a line in the book, facts don't speak for themselves. Because that's another conclusion I arrived at, that just busting a myth is not enough. I kept to the format on the myth busting because I found out also, with people who advised me on that and my agent, that it is indeed to reach a broader public, I need to do this in a way. But then on the left and the right, it was a very conscious decision. So it's not just what happens too much, I think, in academia. It's sort of becomes a political manifesto, almost against the closed border sort of agenda. So I tried to expose, but this was heartfelt. When I hear Dutch ministers of development cooperation talking about Africa and African migration sometimes, it taps into the worst stereotypes of Africa that are pretty colonial. And I have real problems with that. And that is based on my own fieldwork experience as well in Morocco and other countries, where you discover a very different reality about people seeing migration as an investment in the future. How much they may be exploited, it was still much better than to stay at home. So there's this other side of migration. There's the exploitation on the macro level. But this migration being part of this, I want to improve my life strategy, and often quite successfully so on the longer term. So I think you're right, Jan Willem. I tried to provide a more long-term perspective and also a more historicizing perspective. I was talking to that briefly with Jan Breeman, who is here in the room. I think there's a lot of room to, if you historicize things and make clear that at some point in time, Germans even were seen as the hostile immigrant group in the United States. And of course, many other groups. It at least can help to raise awareness, first of all, that we were all immigrants. And that, yes, immigration can cause tensions and generally does cause tensions, but in the longer term, indeed, things look often quite differently. So it's in distinguishing the local short-term impact, which may be quite negative for groups, both migrants and non-migrants, from the longer term, which is indeed a story about panic is not necessary. But what do we do then with the political call to do something about it? And isn't it naive to think people will read the book and think, aha, no, I don't think so. That would be indeed naive. What I hope is that people pick up bits and pieces from the book, that it will help indeed journalists, people who are in NGOs or teachers. I really also hope to reach people in primary and secondary education. And then the International Migration Institute, we have also thinking about a migration education project. Of course, a new iteration of these kind of myths, but then a much more accessible form to insert in primary and secondary education, because that's where the real socialization happens. And then migration is not just about migration, it's also about our world. And I was just referring to the fact how some fears about, poverty and war and population growth leading to mass migration from Africa or climate change are linked to very deeply seated stereotypes about the so-called third world. So this is not just about migration, it's also about how we conceive the world around us. So these are a few things. Yeah, how to do that, I don't know. I've tried to do my best. I can give you one last example. The chapter where I argue that climate change is unlikely to lead to massive transcontinental movements of migrants. I was struggling with that because the last thing I want is that people use that chapter to say climate change doesn't exist. So I begin and I end the chapter by saying climate change is real. It's one of the biggest problems facing humanity. So you have to be writing such a book super conscious about how things may be cherry-picked. So that is the risk indeed. And there's always that risk. But for people who read the whole book, I hope that they will find some confirmation, but will also feel a bit uncomfortable. That's what I really hope on both sides of the debate. Thank you.